This move, the king's pawn opening, immediately stakes a claim in the center and opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, aiming to control central squares and facilitate rapid development. This move symmetrically challenges white's central pawn, leading to well-established and fundamentally sound open games where control of the d4 and d5 squares is paramount. This move develops a knight towards the center, attacks black's e5 pawn, and prepares for kingside castling, a fundamental principle of opening play. This move develops a knight to a natural square, controlling the d4 and e5 central squares and preparing for castling. A standard response in many classical openings like the Ruy-Lopez or Italian game. This move initiates the Ruy-Lopez, a highly respected opening that exerts pressure on black's knight and prepares to develop the kingside quickly. This move, the Morphy defense, is a direct challenge to white's bishop, forcing it to either retreat or exchange, and aims to gain space on the queenside while preventing white from establishing a strong pawn center. This capture breaks black's pawn structure on the queenside, potentially weakening it and creating doubled pawns that can become targets later in the game. Black captures with the d-pawn, disrupting white's control of the center and creating a doubled pawn structure on the c-file, which will require careful management. Castling secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a crucial step in developing your forces after recapturing with the pawn on c6. This move weakens black's kingside pawn structure, potentially creating long-term defensive vulnerabilities around the king. This move is a central pawn break that aims to open lines and challenge black's pawn structure, particularly after the doubled c-pawns. Black recaptures towards the center, opening the d-file for their queen and developing their pieces more actively in this variation of the Ruy-Lopez. This move recaptures the pawn on d4, opening the d-file for white's rook and developing the knight to a central square with tempo against black's queen. This move challenges white's central knight and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure by creating a doubled pawn on c6, while also opening the c-file for black's rook. This move is a strategic retreat for the knight, allowing it to potentially reposition to f4 or g3 to support the kingside attack and prepare for central pawn breaks, while also anticipating black's queenside expansion. Trading queens here simplifies the position, allowing black to consolidate their doubled c-pawns and potentially develop their remaining pieces more freely in the endgame. The rook recapture on d1 opens the d-file for your rook, which is a key strategic goal, and simultaneously defends your knight on e2, centralizing your forces. This move, b6, aims to develop the bishop to a more active square and challenge white's central control, preparing to recapture the pawn on d4. bf4 develops the bishop to an active square, aiming to pressure white's central pawns and prepare for potential kingside attacks. This move develops the rook to a more active position on the semi-open c-file, preparing to contest control of this important central file and potentially apply pressure against white's queenside pawn structure. This knight repositioning aims to control central squares and prepare to challenge black's queenside pawn structure, potentially opening lines for white's rooks. This move develops the knight to a more active square, eyeing the d5 outpost and preparing to support a central pawn advance. This move establishes a strong central knight outpost, controlling key squares and preparing to pressure black's queenside pawn structure. This exchange simplifies the position by eliminating central tension and opens the d-file for white's rook, but black correctly opens a diagonal for their queen and develops their knight to a more active central square. This pawn capture opens the e-file for your rook, creating immediate pressure on black's central pawns and facilitating piece activity. This move repositions the bishop to an active square, preparing to contest the d5 pawn and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares on white's kingside. This move activates the rook, preparing to contest the d-file and support a potential advance of the d-pawn later on. This move activates the bishop, preparing to challenge white's knight and potentially create a more favorable pawn structure by trading. This exchange simplifies the position, converting white's slight development lead into a more concrete advantage in material after recapturing, while forcing black to solidify their doubled pawns. This recapture creates a doubled pawn on the d-file, which could become a structural weakness, but also opens the c-file for black's rook. The knight repositions to g3, aiming to control central squares like e4 and f5 while potentially supporting a kingside pawn. Advance or preparing to redeploy to an active square like e4 or f5. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square where it can exert influence on the central d5 pawn and potentially control the a2-8 diagonal. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create weaknesses in black's defensive structure and potentially launch an attack against the enemy king. This move creates a potential weakness on the kingside by weakening the g6 square and the light squares around the king, while white's knight on g3 is well placed to exploit it. This pawn push aims to gain space on the kingside and potentially create weaknesses around black's king if the pawn advances further, while also restricting the activity of black's bishop on g6. This retreat prepares to reposition the bishop to a more active square on the kingside, potentially supporting a future kingside pawn advance or defending against white's encroaching knights. This move prepares to redeploy the rook to a more active square on the kingside, aiming to exploit the open e-file and potentially create threats against black's king. The king repositions to safety on d7, preparing to join the fight in the center and potentially assist the queenside pawns once they advance. The king repositions to a safer square, clearing the d1 rook's original file and preparing for potential pawn advancements or piece redeployments. Re8 aims to centralize the rook, connect the major pieces, and potentially contest the open e-file, improving coordination and preparing for future pawn advances or piece activity. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially eyeing the central d5 pawn or supporting a kingside advance, while also preparing to contest the open e-file if black consolidates. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, preparing to contest control of the central e-file and potentially challenge white's control of the d5 pawn. This knight maneuver seeks to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting weak pawns or controlling key central squares while supporting further pawn advancements. The move 22, RCE8 brings the other rook to the e-file, challenging white's control and preparing to contest the open file for potential pawn advances or piece exchanges that could simplify the position. This exchange simplifies the material, leading to a rook endgame where white aims to exploit the weak d6 pawn and black must carefully defend against it. The exchange of rooks simplifies the position, allowing black to potentially activate their pieces more freely and contest the central files with improved coordination. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside pawn structure, aiming to create a safer haven for the king and potentially launch a pawn storm later on. The bishop retreats to g8 to avoid tactical threats and prepare for potential kingside activity. while also maintaining crucial defense of the d6 pawn. The king repositions to a more secure central square, preparing to join the fight for central control and potentially activate a rook later in the game. This move aims to create an active queenside pawn majority and challenge white's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for black's rook on the b-file. This move aims to create a queenside pawn majority and potentially establish an outpost on b4, addressing white's slightly passive pawn structure. This move aims to create space on the queenside and potentially launch a pawn storm or open files for the rooks by challenging white's advanced pawns and creating counterplay. This move reinforces the d4 pawn, creating a solid central pawn chain and preventing black's knight from potentially landing on c4. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, eyeing the kingside and supporting the potential advance of the queenside pawns. This pawn push aims to gain space on the kingside and potentially create attacking chances, though it also weakens the kingside pawn structure somewhat. This pawn push, 28, f5, is a risky attempt to open lines on the kingside and create activity, but it weakens white's pawn structure and king safety while potentially overextending black's position. This move prepares to challenge black's rook on e5 by bringing another rook to the open e-file, aiming to simplify the position and potentially exploit white's king safety advantage. This move intends to centralize the king and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside, aiming to create counterplay in a somewhat cramped position. This pawn capture opens the g-file, potentially creating attacking opportunities against black's king if white can subsequently reinforce pieces along that open line. Black exchanges the rooks to simplify the position and prevent white from creating further pawn breaks or exploiting any potential outpost on the e-file. This move brings white's king to a more active central square after the rook exchange, a crucial step in the endgame to participate in pawn races and potentially defend key squares. The king is now active and centralizing, aiming to join the fight for the d5 and f5 squares and support the remaining central pawns while seeking safety. The knight repositions to e6, aiming to exploit the open kingside and potentially attack the weakened pawn structure around white's king. Capturing the knight with the bishop offers black a material advantage and simplifies the position, but it also opens lines for white's king and removes a key defender of black's own king. This knight move repositions the knight to a more active central square, threatening the bishop on h7 and aiming to control key squares like c6 and e6, while also preparing for potential kingside action or defending against black's central pawn push. This move strategically centralizes the king, preparing to support the queenside pawn push while also potentially defending against white's knight's influence. This move creates a passed pawn on the queenside and aims to exploit the potential queenside space advantage, a key strategic objective in this endgame. Black recaptures the pawn, opening the b-file for potential future activity and solidifying their central pawn structure. This knight sortie to c6 is a decisive blow, forking the opponent's king and rook and forcing a significant material recapture or loss. This move captures a central pawn, regaining material equality and opening lines for the king, but exposes it to potential checks and harassment. This move wins a pawn by exploiting black's exposed king and the weak pawn on a5, simplifying into a more favorable endgame. The bishop on e8 is actively repositioning to support the advanced pawn on c4 and potentially prepare to contest the open c-file, aiming to prevent white from creating a passed pawn with further pawn advances. The king's central advance is a risky but often necessary strategy in the endgame to participate actively in the play and support its own passed pawns, especially when the opponent's king is also centrally positioned. The move b-flat-5 attempts to improve the bishop's position by moving it to a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing the white king or supporting pawn advances on the queenside. This knight repositioning to the b7 square aims to challenge black's central pawn majority by creating attacking possibilities on the queenside and potentially supporting a pawn push on the a file. The pawn push to h5 advances the kingside majority and prepares to create a passed pawn, which is a key strategic objective in this endgame given white's encroaching knight. The move kf4 aims to centralize the king, activating it in the endgame and preparing to support the knight's advanced position on b7 while also potentially controlling squares vital for the pawn advance. This move prepares to challenge white's advanced knight on b7 and potentially activate the bishop to a more central square, aiming to disrupt white's coordination. The knight repositions to d8, aiming to contest the crucial d-file and potentially support an advance on the kingside or centralize itself depending on the opponent's response. The advance of the h-pawn to h4 aims to create a passed pawn on the kingside, which becomes more dangerous as pieces are exchanged, and also restricts the mobility of black's kingside pieces. The knight's repositioning to f7 aims to control the critical e5 square, potentially supporting a pawn advance or preparing for a tactical maneuver like na5 or ing5. This pawn advance is a tactical attempt to create a passed pawn by pushing the kingside majority, but it weakens the kingside pawn structure and offers a target for white's pieces. The king's central advance, kg3, prepares to support the potential passed pawn on h5 while simultaneously becoming an active participant in the endgame by seeking shelter and controlling central squares. The capture of the pawn on f5 opens the h-file for black's rook and strengthens the passed pawn on h3, creating significant attacking potential against white's king. This pawn push is a strategic advance to gain space on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn, while also aiming to disrupt black's knight activity. The king moves to a more centralized and active square, aiming to support the d-pawn and potentially create counterplay in the center and queenside. The advance of the a-pawn to a5 aims to restrict black's queenside counterplay and prepare to potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. Black advances the d-pawn to open a new avenue for the queen and prepare to support the pawn majority on the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn. The move advances the passed pawn, aiming to create a decisive threat on the queenside and potentially distract black's king and pieces from the central action. The move 45, kb6 is a logical repositioning of the king to escape the immediate threats on the d-file and to prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn or disrupt white's pawn structure. This knight maneuver aggressively targets black's weakened kingside pawn structure, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially create mating threats or win material. 46. bd7 repositions the bishop to a more active square, ready to defend the pawn on c4 and potentially support an advance of the b-pawn, while also maintaining an eye on the kingside. This pawn push initiates a strategic plan to advance the kingside pawns, aiming to create a passed pawn or open lines for the king and rook in the endgame. Black captures the pawn on a6, a necessary tactical decision to secure material and simplify the position given white's impending pawn advance with the king and knight. This pawn push aims to create a passed pawn on the kingside, potentially opening up critical lines for the white king to advance or to support a further pawn push on the queenside. The move aims to activate the king by bringing it closer to the center where it can offer support to the pawns and potentially participate in the endgame's pawn battles. A crucial aspect as the material continues to simplify. The capture of the pawn on h3 is strategically sound, as it simplifies the endgame by eliminating black's potential passed pawn and activating the white king towards the center, which is crucial in pawn endgames. This move aims to centralize the king, preparing to support the passed pawn on the kingside and to contest the open files that white might try to exploit. The knight repositions to f7, preparing to support the pawn push to f5 and potentially create threats against black's king if it ventures too far from its current safety. This move capitalizes on the exposed king by forcing a capture that regains a pawn, simplifying into an endgame where white's king is more active, although black's passed pawn on the kingside needs careful management. White's king bravely advances to g3, centralizing and offering potential support for the pawn push, while also preparing to defend against black's active bishop. This pawn push aims to create a passed d-pawn, which could become a significant asset in the endgame if white cannot effectively blockade it. The king advances to secure the d5 pawn and to support the potential a-pawn's advance, aiming to create a passed pawn or disrupt black's coordination. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to create threats against white's pawns and potentially support a pawn push of its own. This move forces the black king to the edge of the board, aiming to exploit the exposed king position and potentially create decisive tactical opportunities with the knight and remaining pawns. The move Kd5 is a critical decision as it centralizes the black king, aiming to participate actively in the endgame and potentially support its advanced pawns or challenge white's king. This move activates the knight, repositioning it to a central square where it controls key squares and prepares to support the passed pawn on the d-file. Black's C3 pawn advance aims to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's king's safety, but it weakens the d5 square and may be vulnerable to white's centralized knight. This pawn capture opens the b-file for potential infiltration and creates a passed pawn on the c-file, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and create endgame threats. This pawn push advances into enemy territory, threatening to become a passed pawn and create significant counterplay on the queenside. This move centralizes the king, preparing to support the passed pawn and potentially create a powerful outpost on d5 while also aiming to blockade or capture black's advanced pawns. The move 56, Kd6 aims to centralize the king and prepare to support the passed pawn on the c-file, while also potentially preventing white's king from reaching favorable squares. This move aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting an advance on the kingside or controlling key central squares, while also preparing to defend against black's passed pawn. The bishop's repositioning to b3 aims to control the crucial c4 square and prepare for potential piece exchanges, reinforcing white's strategic positional advantage. This move reinforces the king's central position, preparing to support the advance of the d-pawn and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. The move 58, c2 creates an immediate passed pawn that is very close to promotion, forcing white to address this critical threat. This move, king to d2, is a crucial repositioning to support the advance of the passed c-pawn, aiming to create a new queen or force advantageous exchanges.